Israel, on the early hours of Tuesday morning, crossed the blue line into southern Lebanon for the first time in 18 years, moving ground troops in an attempt to create what some people consider is a buffer zone between the Litani River and the Blue Line, which, as per the UN Security Council resolution, is where the UN peacekeeping forces operate from. Hours after Israel moved its ground troops into southern Lebanon, Iran launched close to 200 ballistic missiles for the second time directly against Israel. The last time was in April this year. In this instance, however, what we see is that of those 200 ballistic missiles aimed at different targets, some got through, unlike in April, where only about out of about 300 got through. And this has led to what people are calling a major escalation in West Asia. To discuss that today, at the print, we have with us Dr. Khinvraj, the professor and director at the Center for Israel Studies at the OP Jindal Global University, as well as visiting faculty at the Ben Gurion University in Israel, as well as Dr. Swasti, who's an associate fellow at the Manohar Parrikar Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
So I'm going to get straight in, and I'm going to bring Dr. Jangid here because, like I said, Israel is now opened its second front in the north. It still has ground troops in Gaza. It is facing attacks, ballistic missile attacks this time from Iran, and where Iran has said it's used some of its most, highly technical missiles, the Fatah missile, I think. I just want you, Dr. Jangir, if you could, to sort of break down the situation for us in terms of what is the next, what happens next.
Well, what happens next is how much Iranian clerics will really put at price their own interest for the sake of saving their face in the region, uh, and bearing the consequences of the brinkmanship that they unleashed from October 8th. Let's say about Hamas, Israel's attack, and all kind of military operations had mixed opinion across the world. But I think when it came to Hezbollah, there was a greater support to what Israel was doing, tacit and some very explicit. Egypt, Jordan, Gulf countries, Saudi Arabia, they all consider Hezbollah as a terrorist organization. They have banned this organization. And for 11 months, Israel did, in a way, have to bear the rockets and drones in the north. 100 Israelis were living homelessly. Not that they were living poorly, they were given hotels and they were given kind of state support that third world countries can't even imagine. So that's not the point. The point was that close to 100,000 people were displaced and Israel de facto lost sovereignty upon the north of Israel. And that's when Israel actually withdrew from Lebanon unilaterally in the year 2000. If you look at the struggle of Hezbollah and Israel, it's in a way ended in the year 2006 with the UN ceasefire 1701. Israel occupied south of Lebanon for almost 18 years, but then it withdrew in the year 2000. Then we had a religion war with Hezbollah in 2006. And Hezbollah wasn't really finding a good excuse to attack Israel. This Hamas incident gave this imperative, but I don't think Hezbollah is an autonomous extra military organization within Lebanon. Hezbollah is de facto an extension of the Iranian regional policy. The way Iran wants to operate in the region, Hezbollah works as its direct agent, run by Iranian commanders who often live and operate from Lebanon. So I think Iran was directly involved in the war from October 8th, and Israel has taken this fight now back to Iran. So it depends. From Israel's point of view, Israel is going to be more aggressive. And I think Netanyahu would really cash on this opportunity to attack Iranian nuclear plants. This is something as an agenda he has been waiting for the last 12 years. There were a number of times when he thought US will allow him to do it. He wasn't allowed. And I think he will do much greater reckless decision now to attack Iranian nuclear programs. It will really get messy for the region.
Right. And here I want to bring in Dr. Rao because the region, uh, the way you see the threads of Iran with Hezbollah, you also see sort of the threads between Moscow and Tehran, or Washington with Tel Aviv, right? So in that sense, if what Dr. Jangid suggests, which is it could get messier, right? Where does that place the situation in the larger geopolitics that we're seeing play out in the battlefields of Ukraine, and now possibly in West Asia?
So yeah, that was a fairly multi-layered question with a lot of entwined questions out there. And just for the sake of clarity, let's sort of I'll try to break it down into different components. So on the one hand, after the Russia-Ukraine war started, you did see a kind of a deepening of strategic alignment between Russia and China. Eventually, Iran, of course, came into that play because of the Shahid drones. And if you remember, initially, thousands of Shahid drones, although Iran earlier denied these charges, but of course, later on, they were pretty obvious that Iran is indeed sending Shahid drones to Russia. And then, of course, eventually North Korea, jumped into it. So what you do see that while there was a war that was going on in East Europe, but the unfolding situation in the West Asian region also played its own role in kind of cementing the fact that there indeed is a geopolitical fragmentation going on. And when I say the geopolitical fragmentation, of course, here I mean, this emerging nexus between Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. Some people also add Pakistan to that. I don't think Pakistan is even dependable enough to be added to any any axis whatsoever. But that said, so you do see that there has been this, emergent axis, like I just said, of these countries that have very little in common apart from two main things. None of them are democracies, the first, and the other is that all of them have somehow uh, bought this narrative that subverting the Western-led global order, subverting the rules-based international order is in their interest because when it comes to Iran, when it comes to North Korea, when it comes to Russia, you see they are also heavily sanctioned countries. So of course you also see a reason there. Apart from that, there's very little that actually binds them together, but you do see that because of the way the war has been unfolding, you do see that these kind of countries are coming together. Now, because you have this axis emerging, Keshav, I think there are two things happening. One is that yes, you today you cannot argue that all these theaters are not connected. You do see that these theaters are getting connected and are getting merged, and the dynamics of one is impacting the dynamics of others. That's the first. And the other thing is about, because you specifically asked me about Russia. So you see, I mean, one thing that I can definitely say is that from the US perspective, there is a lot of focus, there is a lot of pressure on the US security assistance today to continue supporting Ukraine, especially the Biden administration, if you see carefully. On the other hand, there is now a lot of US presence in the West Asian region. In fact, maybe in my later remarks, I would perhaps tell you a little bit about how much of US military presence right now is there in the Mediterranean Sea, across the Mediterranean Sea in terms of military bases, etc. And then you also have this impending sort of crisis, the sense of crisis in the Taiwan Straits. So I think from the US perspective, if you carefully saw, I mean, Israel is actually now going after the 3H shadow instruments that Iran had been resorting to. The first H, of course, stands for Hamas. We all know what happened to Hamas. The other is Hezbollah. And we saw how things really started changing after the pagers started to blow themselves up, etc. And then how they went after its head, and how then, finally Iran retaliated last night. And then now Israel has vowed to sort of retaliate yet again. And then the third H is Houthi, which is in the Red Sea, and the Houthi rebels in the Red Sea. And now you see that the Israelis have also started striking the Houthis. So I think all of this pretty much is in the US interest, even though the US would not like to get directly involved in the war, and US has also always maintained that. But with all this presence in across the Mediterranean region, across the Persian Gulf, also, I think it makes very difficult for Iran to actually really launch a full-fledged, meaningful, strategically meaningful retaliation. What we saw yesterday, I do not think that was strategically very meaningful, because there were too many missiles and too less damage, and it actually just provided Israel with yet another reason that they had been looking for retaliating yet again. So I think that from US's perspective, they are supporting it because it is now suiting their interest. It is also somewhere helping deplete the stockpiles, in Iran, which is obviously going to have a direct bearing on the Russian question, and all the Russian preparedness for the war in Ukraine. We Then there is also this angle of China that we would like to come to, that has at best been giving lip service to the cause of Iran. So finally, I think my point is that today Iran does suffer from what I see as a strategic loneliness. Okay, there is a strategic loneliness. I mean, you do see that the Iranian, the partners and the supporters, I mean, they are mired in their own conflicts, and Iran is pretty much left to itself. And with these three shadow instruments of their state policy, which is, Hamas, Hezbollah, and Houthis, if Israel goes after them like that, it leaves very, very little, I would say, options for actually Iran to do something very meaningful. And we would see how it plays out. But I do not see a full-fledged war with the US jumping in. Everybody understands the implication. But I do see that because the theaters are interlinked, it is actually suiting the US interest right now with what is happening in West Asia. Back to you.
Right. And that brings an interesting point over here. We've seen US, we've seen Iran, we've seen West Asia, and I want to bring Dr. Jangid here because India. India has a close partnership with Israel, I2U2, this Middle East Europe Economic Corridor, though Israel's not a part of it for obvious reasons yet. And then we have Iran, where we have Chabahar, we have the INSTC, we have these interests and a long-standing partnership there. So that's for India's external, but there's also domestically, right? We've seen, small pockets of protests or sort of memory walks or supports for Nasrallah after his death last Friday. So if you could just both on the external front as well as sort of give an inclination on the domestic front, what the sort of escalation means for India.
Well, it means a lot of headaches and in a way unpleasant situations. Let's look at Iran in India's foreign policy. Over last 2 decades, India had made its very choice explicit that it goes to the American side. It has started even joining America and the Western countries to put more sanctions against Iran. It has started voting against Iran in the international agencies, saying Iranian nuclear program is a threat to international peace. When that happened, it really baffled many people because India really got nuclear the way Iran does want to get nuclear. Nevertheless, so what I mean to say is that Iran isn't really an important uh, consideration for Indian foreign policy, whereas Israel has achieved much, let's say, strategic and much bigger space in Indian foreign policy in the last decade. And I think that's why Khamenei's tweet a month, actually not a month, even 3 weeks back, when he said that the Muslims in Gaza and Muslims in India need Iran and the Shia revolution to lead the struggle and their fight. India was very offended with the comparison of Indian Muslims as the Muslims of Gaza. But I think Iranians are really driven by this religious fantasy. What I think is an ideological imperative on Iranian foreign policy, and it doesn't really consider any other important value than what they believe in the Shia school of Islam. Otherwise, look at what happened in Lebanon. When Shia leader was killed, there were celebrations in Lebanon. There were celebrations even in Syria. These are countries where Sunni populations really thought that Hezbollah was trying to dominate these parts in the favor of the Shia Muslims, oppressing the interests of the Sunnis or the Maronite Christians. So I think it doesn't serve any purpose going back to India to endorse anything that Iran and Hezbollah do. However, India got a lot of things to worry about. Like 3 days back, there were 100,000 people in Lucknow on a candle march with big posters of Nasrallah, calling him a martyr and a shaheed, and burning the posters of the Israeli Prime Minister, which had a line called "War Criminal." Now, Netanyahu might very well be a right case for war crimes in the international relations. No defense for him. However, I think Delhi will be very worried about what happened in Lucknow 3 days back. So I think we got a lot of these domestic factors to worry about, but India does have very explicit and I'm going to say very uh, obvious foreign policy choice, which is to stand with Israel. 2 days back, in his latest call with Netanyahu, Narendra Modi's statement, which was given to the press, maybe there were a lot of other sentences that were not given to the press. The one sentence which was given to the press was that Narendra Modi spoke to Netanyahu and he said India is with Israel against the struggle, you know, against the struggle for terrorism, against the terrorism. I think so. I think India still thinks what Israel is doing is something that that goes into the larger struggle of modern, not radical religious values.
Right. And I mean, you mentioned Netanyahu a lot, Dr. Jangid, and I want to bring Dr. Rao in here because there are claims that, his actions and Israel's actions here is trying to reorder West Asia, right? And in your previous remarks, you sort of identify that this reordering that is taking place is in US's interests. And as Dr. Jangid has mentioned, Hezbollah is a terrorist organization recognized by most of the West Asian countries, right? Be it Egypt, be it Saudi Arabia, be it Bahrain, they all recognize Hezbollah as a terrorist country, terrorist organization, right? So here you see this sort of the three H's being attacked. You see strategic loneliness for the Iran. You see Israel, who has also lost a lot of international reputation. So, how do you see this reordering of West Asia that is taking place in the larger interests of US, Russia, and China?
Oh, well, there are two things. I mean, I don't think anybody really wanted this reordering, if you call it. I don't think there is a lot of chaos. There's a lot of ambivalence, and I'm not sure what kind of a reordering will come out. It would largely be dependent on how really, to what extent does Israel go. And Israel probably has shown that it has a no holds barred approach when it comes to tackling or sort of avenging the undoings of the 7th October attack. So I think we would see all of that is is going to be determined by how far Israel is going to go, how Iran is going to retaliate, how far is America going to come. But I think if you really look at the case scenarios, I mean the scenario building that we were doing before all this and before until last year when this entire thing had started, I think the biggest worry of everybody was that what if there is a full-fledged war between Iran and Israel? So I think um, just to sort of reiterate what I was already saying, that it is this particular factor which is going to see what kind of a reordering perhaps happens. But like I said the other before in my previous remark, that yes, you do have, for example, a lot of American presence right now. You have about in the Eastern Mediterranean, you have Americans in the Red Sea. There are so many several guided missile destroyers in the Gulf of Oman. They have their aircraft carrier in. They have across the Middle East, they have about 40,000 Americans, and they're trying to. They recently said that they might add a few more thousands to that. So, with that kind of a heavy American presence, Saudi Arabia and UAE, two important Sunni players in the region, absolutely not interested in supporting Iran. In fact, there was obviously a normalization process which was underway, and we were speaking about IMEC, and I would like to sort of come back to that and connect the dots to what we were discussing. But their strategic interest clearly being very different. Now you have an Israel which has a very no holds barred approach. You also see the other powers in the region are very sick and tired of how Iran kind of champions itself as the axis of resistance. So I think there would be some sort of a reordering, of course, and this is going to be depending upon how Iran, what kind of strategic choices does Iran actually finally resort to. It would depend on that, but it would be in the U.S. interest. Why? Because, like I was earlier arguing, that you really have to understand how the U.S. is. Doesn't have the capabilities to sort of to really support Ukraine on the one hand, Israel on the other, and then Taiwan on the third. So this kind of a security assistance, the more this axis comes together, and this axis, which is the Iran, Russia, China, North Korea axis, comes together, the easier it becomes for the US to sort of to find its own interest in supporting these, because eventually what is happening, like the previous statement I was giving you this example, that now the Israelis have told the Iranians that you have to be ready for this retaliation, and now you know that from the Caspian Sea ports where all the weapons consignments are actually going from Iran to Russia, and if those are attacked, it would be a problem. And for America, it perfectly suits America's interest if those are attacks, right? Even though America would not do it by itself, whether Israel chooses to do it or not is a different thing. Now again, the other thing on the Houthis, I mentioned the Red Sea, the UK and US have been launching joint attacks against the Houthis, and that not really has yielded much results, especially to reinstate the maritime commerce of in that region. Now the Israelis have decided to do it. Will Does it serve American interest? Of course, it serves the American interest. Okay, so this is a kind of an opportunity for the US as well. And by the way, don't be under the impression that if Trump was to come to power, all this will absolutely stop. I have been trying to make this argument for a while now that even if Trump were to come to power, the security assistance would become transactional. It will not stop, because eventually all these orders are coming back to the American military industrial complex. So it perfectly suits the American interest to actually deplete the combined stocks of these countries, because now we understand that there is just so much of this overlap which is there, in terms of drone technology, in terms of Russia promising them with enhancing their nuclear programs, etc. So you absolutely see there is a complex web, and reordering of it would be, or weakening of it. Let's say weakening of it. I'm not sure if we can call it reordering. Maybe it's too early for that, but for sure the weakening of it would be in the American interest. And now, Keshav, if you allow me 2 minutes, I would like to come back to IMEC. I think one also has to, in India, somewhere kind of wake up and spell coffee that IMEC is not going to be operational, because the point is not about reinstating peace in the Middle East. I think there are everybody's interest to actually reinstate peace. The question is that even if peace were to come back, it is going to remain a rather fragile peace. And from that logic, how commercially viable or how economically viable would it be for Indian interests to actually invest? So I think one of the ways to relook or reimagine the IMEC project, or let's say connecting the diverse geographies through economic corridors, if you think that that is the sine qua non of the IMEC project, I think one has to really break that down into three components. One is the eastern side of it, where it's about connecting India to the Middle East, which is very much functioning very well. I mean, we have strategic partnerships with countries in the region out there. It's wonderful. One is the central leg, which is of what is happening in West Asia. So once you reach UAE and then you get on the rail corridor, go all the way to Haifa. I don't know how that is going to play out, honestly. And then is the third component, which is the European side of it. And a lot of times, when we're discussing IMEC, unfortunately, a lot of in discussions in India, we just don't really bother to talk about the European leg or the Western leg, forgetting that IMEC in the first place is a PGII-backed initiative, and PGII is a G7 initiative, right? So I think what we need to be doing is that, on the one hand, yes, and just as my final point for this time, which is that we need to look at alternative routes. The European Union, there is a lot of research going on about how do we develop alternative routes inside of West Asia. I'm not an expert on West Asia, so I would not really comment on that, because my opinion is that peace is going to remain very fragile there. The other is to actually look at it in terms of India developing its outreach with other ports which do not have so much Chinese dominance. For example, Marseille in France, or Trieste in Italy, or Piraeus, of course, in Greece. But apart from Piraeus, there's also Thessaloniki, which is then connected to the three seas and 14 other countries in Central and Eastern Europe. So what I'm saying is that I think it makes much more sense to look at IMEC into these slice it down into these three components and work on the other components, so that whenever the time is right, if the time is right, you could actually make it fall into place. But otherwise, if you keep focused on the West Asian region, IMEC is a non-starter then. Back to you.
Right. And thank you, because my last question was going to be on this, but now I have that for you, Dr. Jangid. It's the North-South Transport Corridor. It was India's first major transport corridor, 2000, 2001, if I remember, in St. Petersburg. Iran is a integral part of this corridor to connect India with Russia. While there is this realignment of Indian sort of foreign policy, we're seeing Quad, we're seeing all of the sort of movement to the US. There is also this transport corridor that India is a part of, the North-South Transport Corridor. What does this mean? For India, if IMEC on one side and its route to Europe is struggling, it has the North-South Transport Corridor, and before the Ukraine war was a secondary route to Europe. But thanks to the Russian sanctions, that's still questionable. But nevertheless, that is still there. So, what does this mean for the Indian interests for that, sir?
It just means far more complexities that India is capable of dealing with. One of the important point in IMEC is, and maybe Swati is right, that there isn't an alternative route within West Asia. The key component is Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia is still not rejecting a full diplomatic peace with Israel. Till today, they are saying if Israel commits to a two-state solution in the long run with the Palestinians and a civilian administration in Gaza, Saudi Arabia is willing to have a full diplomatic peace. That is something I think India is working behind corridors, that Israel doesn't ruin all of its allies' interests while making these wars long-term wars. Let's really understand this from the Israeli perspective. Israel has not concluded any of its operations in Gaza over a year. It has started now a new war in Lebanon. And the only way Israel will get its people back in North to live is when Israel is going to reoccupy Lebanon of the South. So this means Israel might be there for another decade. Both of these wars will be long-term wars from the Israeli perspective. The way Israel is acting, it doesn't have any other political understanding or the courage. It just relies heavily on the military methods. But I think India might be in a position to, if you look at the statements of Jayashankar, he's extremely unkind to Israel in his last statements, where he's saying this has to stop. And I think if Saudi Arabia and Israel can have a working understanding, then IMEC can really have a chance. Otherwise, it remains a non-starter. I don't think anything through Iran can also develop in long term for India's interest. Iran is a very fragile ally of India. Its philosophy, its political agenda works extremely against India. In fact, there is a lot of inbuilt tension of Iranian policies about the Indian interest. So forget that they are two different beings, but they actually have inevitable clash on certain things when it comes to US or Iran or nuclear program. And second, Russia. I don't think India will build any hopes on Russia once what Putin did in the last 2 years. So I think India is in a bad situation, and Israel has become a liability for the Indian foreign policy. The way Israel has become liability for American foreign policy. I do want to say something that Swati really emphasized in two of her statements, that a lot of it goes into the American interest, what Israel is doing. I wonder if one looks at Joe Biden, I don't think Joe Biden wanted this to happen at all. And I don't think he's a duplicitous man who will say something for the sake of saying. And I think Kamala Harris is herself very clear. I think the way American diplomacy has worked, at least the Democrats, in the last 2 decades, they have realized that Netanyahu is a danger to the two state solution. And they have been fighting Netanyahu from inside. So I think Democrat presidents do not see Israel going in the right way. They think that not having a two state solution will really make the region far more unstable, far more unpredictable, which is fundamentally against the American interest. So I think America is more worried than more, relaxed about some of the things that are taking place.
Right, and thank you for that. And that's sort of my last question. And thank you, Dr. Rao and Dr. Jangid, for joining the print for this conversation. And as always with West Asia, it leaves a lot more questions than answers. And I think that's something that we've seen since the current rules-based international order was first formed. But nevertheless, I think there's a lot for India to think, a lot for India to do. And thank you so much for joining us here at the point.
Thank you.
Thank you, Keshav. Thank you. Thank you.